fact that accessing that right to employability, that working in itself can contribute to the process of recovery, was, I think, in Vandana's presentation, symbolic of an understanding going beyond just the intervention model. And once we are clear about what that shift really is, then much of what we are saying actually falls into place. The other really heartening point which Justice Rumapal raised as well is that it's phenomenally encouraging to see both an acceptance of this within governmental structure and an encouragement of this, which is a major shift, because if society is the reason why that right has been taken away, then society is also the reason, or society is the vehicle by which that right can be reinstated, as it were. And in that, government and civil society are equally parts of that society. So that this dialogue is happening between government and civil society is actually is a very encouraging thing. As we move away from these positions to see what is being done on the ground by organizations which work with mental illness, we would talk about what the Banyan or the RFS or SCARF have done, and with that we're going to go to these presentations. Since the technology has come into place, because the need for the rambling, so yeah, I invite you guys. Thank you.
Some of the lights be switched off. Lights off.
The Banyan's Community Mental Health Program and the Urban Mental Health Program. And I'd start with this data that is which Vandana has already presented, that is 12.6% of persons with mental illness participate in the workforce, while 41.3% of the general population participate in the workforce. And among non-workers, around 87% are not engaged in paid or household work. And among the 88% of persons with mental illness who did not work, more than half of them had worked before the onset of illness. And nearly 3/4 of those who are not working now but had worked earlier cite mental illness as an important reason for loss of work. And this is much higher in urban than rural areas. So these were the aims of the study, to investigate the linkages between mental health and work. And the work pattern that emerges from this study can help in planning for rehabilitation and family-based interventions of the two projects that were being studied. The objectives were to understand the reasons for dropout from work, the quarterly work consistency for the past 1 year, differences in illness and disability severity, duration of illness, duration of treatment, and age at onset of illness among workers and non-workers, and differences in family burden among workers and non-workers. The scales that were used were the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, 24 items, IDEAS, Pai and Kapoor Family Burden Scale, and also the Enhanced Symptom Checklist. The inclusion criteria was that clients with severe mental disorders, common mental disorders, epilepsy, and substance use disorders were included. Treatment history of a minimum period of 1 year with the Banyan's OP clinics, and treatment regularity for a minimum period of 1 year. Clients belonging to the working age group of 18 to 59 years, and absence of mental retardation. And this is the sample size that we drew from both the clinics. clients with the community mental health program in Kanchipuram and 43 clients with the urban mental health program in Chennai. And a total of 96 clients, and in each project, half the sample were workers and half were non-workers. And this is the economic activity of the clients, that is a larger proportion are engaged in the service sector, it is 64%. And if you look at the activity status, that is what activities were these 96 clients engaged in the past 1 year, a large proportion of them, as you can see, were especially in the community mental health program, were engaged in household work, that is household duties. And in the urban mental health program, 29, that is close to 30%, belong to the category others. That is, they neither worked for a remuneration outside, nor did they do any form of household work. And among those who did not work, more than half of them cited mental illness as a reason for not working. Whereas nearly 30% said that they did not want to go to work because they were engaged in household work. And this was largely among women. And among the non-workers, what we noticed was that most of them experienced poor communication, poor social sense, social withdrawal, poor rapport, and all of these impede the ability to reintegrate into the labor market. The data on work consistency, that is, the year was split into 4 quarters, and what we found is that around 20 to 30% of all the workers were inconsistent in work, that is, they were not regular in work. And this was especially higher among casual laborers and self-employed. And this is no surprise because 20% of the general population itself, that is of casual laborers, are not regular in work because of the seasonal nature of their work. So that, as you can see, from the second variable onwards, there is a difference between, in fact, there is a difference on all the domains among workers and non-workers. And was at 28 years for workers and 26 years for non-workers. That is, the age at onset was earlier for non-workers. The average duration of mental illness was higher among non-workers. That is, for a period of 10 years when compared to a period of 7 years for workers. The average duration of treated illness was also higher among non-workers, which is surprising. The mean psychiatric rating scale score was higher among non-workers than workers. That is, 32 was the score for non-workers, whereas 30 was the score for workers. The mean IDEA score was 9 for non-workers, whereas it was 4.8 for workers. And among all these, the average duration of mental illness, duration of treated illness, BPRS, and IDEAs, the difference was statistically significant. This is the mean family burden score by the work status, which also shows that family burden was higher among non-workers than workers. And this difference was also statistically significant. The characteristics of the caregivers are that most of them are women. They are primarily in the older age group and mainly parents of the clients. Which shows that caregivers themselves are aging and they will experience a decline in financial resources, their own physical health and functional ability. So what are the rehabilitation programs that can be offered in the project itself? So the suggestions were for social skills training and family-based interventions, focusing on occupational recovery of the client, which addresses minimum communication, poor rapport, poor social sense, social withdrawal, and poor social skills, and family-based interventions. So the employment support services would be organized along these lines. At intake of new clients, an assessment should be done for vocational interventions. The client's job readiness and barriers to employment have to be elicited. The employment cell has to work with the client in preparing her or him for job readiness. And after placement, the employment cell has to continue to engage with the client and support her or him to retain the job. The home-based interventions can be offered by the community mental health team who form the backbone of the community programs of the family. So for those clients who prefer to work in the home and who do not want to go to paid work, these are the interventions or checklists that could be done by the CMHT. That is imparts skills training which can improve their activities of daily living, use a checklist of functional levels when they visit homes of the clients, keep track of the progress and report any deterioration to the vocational team, in counseling and other employment support services to the caregivers as well. Good afternoon everybody, I am Nivedita. I represent the Richmond Fellowship Society. There will be two parts to my presentation. One is the study that we did on the efficacy of the Halfway Home program, and also a little bit about our experience with job placements at the daycare center. This was a study that was published in the IJP in 2011. Basically looks at the efficacy of the Halfway Home program that we run in Bangalore. When we talk about rehabilitation, especially psychosocial rehabilitation, there are very few studies that look at assessing outcomes, especially in the Indian context. So what we tried to do was to understand, we do realize that our work has been effective. There has been nothing that has been systematic and documented well in terms of the efforts that we have done. So we do realize outcome research in mental health interventions, especially rehab, is relatively new. And a lot of studies that show rehab interventions are effective in a variety of areas, especially level of functioning. It improves ADL, activities of daily living of people, especially with severe mental illnesses, improvement in terms of level of fitness levels, interpersonal skills, self-control. Interpersonal also branches out into improving better relations with family members, money management. A lot of studies that also focus on employment, especially studies that say interventions have helped in improving job seeking and job adjustment skills. The amount of time that a person with severe mental illness spends in the community in productive, engaging, useful activities, as well as level of independent living. This study was primarily to look at the efficacy of the rehab program at the Halfway Home called Asha, which we run in Bangalore. A little bit about the Halfway Home itself. It's located in a residential facility in South Bangalore. Houses a maximum of 21 residents, both men and women. Usually our clients are between 18 to 50. The upper age limit even goes up to 55. Primary diagnosis that we get in are schizophrenia and bipolar affective disorders, and admission is voluntary to the Halfway Home. So consent to stay and be part of the program is an important prerequisite. The program also follows the therapeutic community approach as a model to base our rehab interventions. Again, the basic ideas are democratization, that is residents, as we call them, have an important say in the activities of the program because it's a program that's driven by them. There is a lot of permissiveness in terms of the tolerance to what we call as maladaptive or problem behaviors. The idea is to allow these behaviors to emerge in a protected environment, in an emotionally supportive environment, get the clients to reflect on the reality, especially the social consequences of such behaviors, and then protect them to look at or experiment with more healthy or more constructive ways of adjusting. So in that sense, there's a lot more permissiveness to what we call as disruptive behaviors. A lot of reality confrontation that does happen as part of the therapeutic community living experience. And this confrontation doesn't necessarily come from the staff or the professional team. A lot of it comes from the residents because it's a lot of peer pressure, the peer influence that motivates people to change. And of course, the idea of communalism and shared living. The Halfway Home offers a structured program and varied therapeutic interventions. Again, training in ADL, social skills, a lot of focus on community meetings, artwork,
work that happens to be part of the group therapeutic programs, planned recreation, physical exercises, training in financial money management, strategies to improve medication compliance, because we do realize that medication is a very important mainstay of recovery. Inculcating a work habit and vocational training for which they are referred to the daycare. Psychoeducation, a lot of work with the clients and the family that does go on. Individual counseling that's done once a week or more in once a week or once in 2 weeks, depending on the requirement and the need of the client. Group therapy sessions, again, that do focus on interpersonal issues, adjustment, long-term plans, future, and so on. And family therapy sessions that happen once in 3 months, where the families are required to come and stay with the client at the center, be part of the program. The study looked at 54 clients with schizophrenia or affective disorder who stayed at the halfway home for a minimum of 6 months. And the study was a retrospective evaluation based on review of the individual case files maintained at the center. The inclusion criteria was a minimum of 6 months of stay and an illness of more than 2 years duration. A tool called the Progress Evaluation Checklist was developed to assess the level of functioning of the clients. This was tested for content validity and reliability. Basically, the tool consists of 37 items in 10 domains. Each item is rated on a 5-point scale. And higher the score, more is the dysfunction in that particular area. The 10 domains are self-care, following a routine, interpersonal relations, participation in community and leisure activities, communication, vocational activities, family relationship, general behavior, money management, and getting around. The data that was collected was socio-demographic details from the case files. And then the evaluation checklist was scored for 2 levels, one at the time of admission and at the time of discharge for each of the 54 clients. And the rating was done by staff of the other centers, not necessarily the halfway home. And the raters were blind to the admission and discharge rating of the samples. And the files were also randomly distributed between pre and admission and discharge ratings to others. So there was a blind that was created there also. And the investigator who did the final scoring was not aware of the client identity and status. These were done mainly to minimize bias because it was within center study. The socio-demographic profile that we found were majority of the residents were between 24 to 31 years, which is relatively a very young group. 74% were male, 26% were female. The average duration of illness was 10 years. The average stay of the residents was a little under a year at the halfway home, and 89% had schizophrenia, 7% in the population had, in the sample had schizoaffective, and 4% had bipolar disorders. And a paired sample t-test was used to compare changes in client progress between admission and discharge. And it was found that on all parameters, all 10 domains, there was a statistically significant improvement that was demonstrated. This suggests that the program has had a positive impact on the level of functioning, and especially for persons with chronic and persistent severe mental illnesses, living in a supportive community, offering adequately planned programs that are therapeutic, with a specific focus on skills training, does facilitate recovery. And we also found that families also benefit because of their stay here. They see the progress periodically, and having their clients improve functioning automatically lessens their burden of care. Plus, over a period of time, with the sessions that we've found helpful with families, there's a lot of focus on skills training for family members, be it basic communication, assertiveness skills, dealing with day-to-day difficult behaviors, what are the long-term plans for the client. We do find that building their capacities and competencies also helps. And we also found that one of the major agents of change has not specifically been the staff contribution or the staff-run program, but a lot of credit goes to the therapeutic community aspect of working, where there is a lot of peer influence, a lot of peer motivation to change and to sustain that change. There were a few limitations of the study. One is that it was retrospective, so there was no planned evaluation strategy built into the study. There were gaps in information and documentation because we relied on case files. And a possible bias related to staff subjectivity, though it was minimized using the blind. Another thing the study did not look at was the specific effects of various components of the rehab program in terms of the outcome, and also how these specific components interact with client characteristics and illness profile. Another thing the study did not look at is how each of the components in turn impact the overall outcome of recovery or adjustment. Some of the things we learned from the study was can provide more studies like this are required that can provide guidelines for future research. Probably a prospective longitudinal study would help to enable us get more specific answers, especially understanding the long-term impact and sustainability. So that was about the first part. The second bit is, since we are discussing a lot about employability, there's nothing specific talking about employability in the study, so I just thought we'd put in a few of our experiences relating to job placement efforts. We also run a daycare and vocational training center at Bangalore. So some of our points have been just experiences we've had with placement of our residents from the daycare, the halfway home, and the long stay home. Some of the exit options we've looked at for our clients have been open job placements, competitive employment as the preferred outcome or exit option. Some of our clients in the daycare have been successful in holding jobs outside. Again, sheltered employment for a lot of our clients from the long stay and the daycare at the daycare center itself. Self-employment in terms of a few of our clients, for example, we have a long-term resident in the halfway home who's a very good artist. So one of the things we've looked at is have his paintings sold at a charity program as a fundraiser for him. So that has been a means, he has been doing this consistently, so that's a means of self-employment for him because his family is not willing to take him back and he is not willing to get back to his family either. So some of the residents of the long stay home, for example, have their own boutique at the long stay home that they use to generate income for themselves. And some of them have also gone back to doing home-based work. The kinds of jobs again have been largely semi-skilled, either helping out in a family business. Some of them have gone into offices as helpers, front office, data entry kind of jobs, medical transcription. Some of them have also been on the job training. That's one aspect we've found, gradually moving them onto a sort of temporary transitional employment kind of phase and then moving on to a job. Some clients have also enrolled in courses outside for additional skill development, like a medical transcription course or a front office or secretarial managerial kind of courses. So that have helped them to sort of brush up their skills or acquire new skills that can help them in the job market. Some of them, like I said, have got back to working at the parent organization itself in the sheltered workshop. Some of them have got back jobs. For example, we have a postgraduate college, so some of them do help in the library to type out documents, data entry, that sort of thing. Some of them have been placed in other NGOs that work with the disabled. For example, we have a client who had probably an autistic spectrum disorder with moderate mental retardation. So he was at the daycare for about 2 years. The main work we did was a lot of pre-vocational skills building with him. And then he moved in. His main thing was he wanted to work on a machine. Didn't matter what machine it was. So his family found a job placement for him at another institute called the Ramana Maharshi Academy for the Blind. They do this paper packaging, cardboard sheets. So he now operates that machine. He works in 2 shifts voluntarily. So he's doing very well in that place. Another avenue that we found quite by chance is having a peer employer. So we've had a few of our clients employed by a person who's a recovered who's recovered from a mental illness herself. She is an architect, an interior designer. She runs her own firm. So she volunteered to take in 2 of our clients at her firm, and they're doing very well. And a lot of our placements have been identified largely informally, mostly through family contacts. And we found that clients prefer this kind of an arrangement because they're more familiar with the employer and the work atmosphere. In terms of the process, one of the things that we also look at is handling client dependency towards the center or the staff. So there's a lot of anxiety about moving out of a sheltered, protective environment. So that's how our efforts are to move the more functional persons out within a specific time period, say not longer than a year or so. And self-employment ventures have been successful, for example, with avenues like screen printing, because the investment is lesser. There's a family member already into it. So there's somebody that can sort of keep track of the person and so on. And some clients have also been referred to placement agencies run by other agencies that place physically disabled clients. But our experience there has also not been very successful because these agencies do screen clients and they have to fulfill a minimum criteria. Like for data entry, they require a specific speed of 50 words per minute or something in typing, but our clients are not able to do it. So they go in for a refresher course there, and still somehow they've not been able to be on par with physically disabled or non-mentally disabled trainees there. And the basic inputs that we give them are a lot of pre-vocational skills or skills to help them with preparing for jobs in terms of the basic things like getting into a work habit or a routine, working on their motivation enhancement. A lot of them say, anyway, my family looks after me, so why should I, work so hard for a living? So we do have to work a lot on getting them to understand why a job is important for them. And of course the required social skills, even to converse and manage on a day-to-day basis, transport and so on. A lot of vocational skills training, and of course preparing for attending job interviews. We did realize that client and family consent is a must, especially in terms of the kind of job options being explored for clients, and also the issue of whether to disclose the illness to a prospective employer, something that keeps coming back over and over again. Regarding disclosure of the illness, we've